right, let's go to page 11. I will go through everything is quick. I will go through so much, it's going to blow your mind. Okay, so on page 11, lots of stuff happened. All right, I'll see you. Okay, conservatism, resentment politics, culture war, right there. That's kind of the conservative revival of the late 70s, early 80s. And it was based upon a number of things. But one of the big ones was resentment against the civil rights and the women's rights movement. Anger over maybe the thought was overturning traditional values. It was also anger over the inflation, especially high gas prices of the 1970s. Also, resurgence of the Cold War and the fear that the communists, that the Soviet Union was starting to win the Cold War, especially after the Vietnam War. And the growth of the religious right, which kind of fit in with the culture war, with the idea that they're abandoning traditional values. And for the first time in 1980, evangelical Protestant Christians voted overwhelmingly for one party, voted Republican. And it would be like that to this very day. But there was a lot of backlash against civil rights. Yeah, I just got to find a play. I know how to dance.
Yeah. We're gonna deal with it.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. Next, election of 1980. So the election of 1980, Jimmy Carter was running for re-election the Democrat, but he was plagued by the hostage crisis in Iran and high oil prices. So he's plagued by these issues. And so he was blamed for a lot of the really high inflation. And the Republicans nominated a very conservative and very charismatic former actor named Ronald Reagan, who really pushed that he would turn the country around with conservative economics and increased military spending. We could win this Cold War. We could win a nuclear arms race. And there's lots of reasons why, but what looked like it was going to be a very close election turned out to be a landslide victory for Reagan. Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter. That rarely happens. There'd be a big victory over an incumbent president, but Reagan would win, partially because of anger over high prices. High prices really bother people. We will find that out again very soon. Next, Reaganomics and the deficit. Reaganomics was Ronald Reagan's conservative supply-side economic plan, basically trickle down, which was massive tax cuts for the very wealthy, unprecedented tax cuts for the very wealthy, and cuts in government spending, government aid, like aid for college. Aid, cut back on regulations like environmental regulation. And completely ended any antitrust regulation, which we are now put back in that. So no more regulation on monopolies. And cut school lunches, things like that, which we're doing right now. So it's basically what's happening right now started in the 1980s. And two things you must add to that. First off, the Great Compression ended immediately with Reaganomics. And it turned into the Great Divergence. The gap between the rich and the poor began to grow in 1980. And now it is growing at a rate that's hard to even imagine. The gap between the tiny group on top and everybody else. And it was promised that budget deficits would drop because of economic growth. The exact opposite happened. The US budget deficit grew the fastest it ever had in history. In fact, under the Reagan years, there was more debt. It is 8 years than all the previous 204 years combined. I should add, that will be superseded by the debt in this next. Wow, is it going to go on? We're talking trillions of dollars in debt are coming in the next couple of years. That's not necessarily bad, but the defense bill. Reagan also initiated a massive defense bill. 10% increase in defense spending. Because Carter wanted 5, so he wanted to double it, claiming that the Soviets had this massive advantage in weapons and material, which was not true, kind of like the bomber gap I talked about in 52. And in 1983, Reagan accelerated the Cold War by doing a number of provocative things to basically provoke a Soviet action, including calling them the evil empire and also joking about destroying the world. And the Soviets in 1983 were absolutely convinced that the United States was going to attack. And as we would find out later, came within hours of ordering a full-scale nuclear attack on the United States. I'm glad I did not know. It's in high school. So, Nicaragua. Nicaragua had the dictatorship in Nicaragua that the U.S. supported was overthrown and replaced with a kind of socialist leaning, but would turn into a dictatorship. And the U.S. is going to aid basically a bunch of cutthroats named the Contras, literally like it sounds, CONTRAS, the Contras. And Congress will ban this because many people thought the United States was going to get involved in another Vietnam. It kind of looked like that was going to happen. And that would devolve into a bloody, horrible civil war. But it just seemed like the Cold War was expanding dramatically. Out of that is going to become Iran-Contra. Iran-Contra was secret arms deal. So the United States sold weapons to Iran, then to turn around and sell to the Contra guerrillas in Nicaragua. All of this was illegal. To take the proceeds from selling weapons to Iran, which was illegal because of what happened with the Islamic Revolution in 78, 79, and Iran taking U.S. hostages for 400 days. And this is one of the biggest violations of the law by any administration in history. Almost 100 people are going to be indicted for this. President Reagan claimed he did not know or did not remember over 130 times, somehow got off. Partially because it was clear that he was in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. For about 5 years. Which is a tragic, horrible disease, but also at the same time, we had a president with Alzheimer's. It was triggered by an assassination attempt on him, which I'll tell you about after the exam. Gorbachev and arms control. I know, remember I told you I'm going very fast? Somebody like, oh wait, I want to know more. I promise I'll fill in the blanks, I promise. Gorbachev and arms control. Mikhail Gorbachev became the premier of the Soviet Union, kind of like the head of the Soviet Union in 1984, and he immediately tried to initiate arms control. Because he wanted to save the Soviet Union that was collapsed. Soviet Union was collapsed. And this would trigger a series of events that would lead to the end of the Cold War, triggered by Gorbachev. And the fact that when Reagan found out we nearly blew the world up in 1983, he finally went from being, hey, nuclear war is okay, to we better save the world. Yes, Reagan will soon be called a communist by conservative Republicans. It's interesting how quickly that happened in the United States, but there would be the first armed control agreement with the Soviet Union since early 1970s would be started under Reagan, completed under the next president, but also lead to the end of the Soviet Union. The Cold War would end quite suddenly in 1989 because the Soviet Union was in collapse and the reforms for Gorbachev actually didn't save the Soviet Union. It triggered a rebellion, not really rebellion, but this kind of popular uprising to have more freedom in that totalitarian state. And it would be personified by something that still blows me away. You can see it right over there. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. And I still can't believe that happened. It still just blows me away. Yes, I have many pieces of the Berlin Wall. Because I'm really cool. You can buy them. Moving on. The Persian Gulf War. There was a bloody, horrible war triggered by the Islamic Revolution between Iraq and Iran that turned into a bloody draw. After that war, Iraq thought they had US support, invaded Kuwait in 1990, invaded Kuwait. Well, the United States, for various reasons, decided to send over 500,000 troops. 500,000 troops and had over 30 countries allies up to push Iraq out of Kuwait. Kuwait was no friend of the United States. This was kind of a political effort to control oil. Saudi Arabia, we put troops in Saudi Arabia, buying them, so Iraq was going to attack. And Iraq was pushed out because their military was comparable to the US and Britain and France and everybody else. But the United States left the dictator of Iraq in power, Saddam Hussein, who the US now put in power 11 years earlier. Nothing will come out of this. We will come back to the pushing button. They're like, yay, we won a war. Okay. The anti-crime bill. In 1994, brand new president, Democrat, Bill Clinton. Oh, almost forgot. The Persian Gulf War and the end of the Cold War would be under the Republican president who replaced Reagan, his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, who would only be one term. He'd be defeated by Bill Clinton, a Democrat. In fact, 92 would be the last time Montana voted for a Democrat. So, I mean, as a state, the electoral votes. It's been pretty close in the last two elections. The anti-crime bill. This was passed under President Clinton, and it was at this early 90s was the time of the highest crime in American, actually world history, was in the 1990s. So much more crime than today. But the anti-crime bill, but this was not only incredibly harsh criminal penalties, it was personified by blatant racist elements of the law to attack, to prosecute mostly African Americans and Hispanic. And this will come back to haunt Bill Clinton's wife, Hillary Clinton, which tried to run for president again in 2016, 2008 especially. Oklahoma City, 1994, one of the biggest domestic terrorist attacks happened in American history, where right-wing extremists blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 200 people with a fertilizer bomb. Almost all the terrorist attacks in the United States, there's been very few terrorist attacks in the US since the 70s. We've had very few, but almost all have been committed by right-wing extremists. And over 200 people would be murdered in this terrorism. The federal building in Washington, the Murrah building. We just put down the federal building in front. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Did I tell you I was going to go fast? Is this helping? North American Free Trade Agreement. And that was going to be to get rid of all tariff barriers between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. To open up massive free trade. And the thought was this would open up Canada and Mexico to US goods, increase employment. But a lot of people, and especially labor unions and a lot of Democrats, oppose this for what's going to happen out of NAFTA. Yes, it did expand trade, but this is going to trigger a wave that was already starting, but would really pick up here of US companies closing down their factories in the United States and moving them to Mexico because the wages were cheaper and no environmental laws. And see the beginning of deindustrialization. Because we live in Montana, we don't have industry. But if you go to like Ohio, you can see the remnants of this, or Michigan. There's the reasons why there's so much resentment, because fewer opportunities for people, especially without college diploma. Oh, one more thing it triggered. It also devastated small Mexican farmers. And that's going to trigger a significant number of Mexicans feeling they have no choice but to come to the United States to try to get jobs. So there'll be a wave of undocumented immigrants coming in from Mexico. And that'll be trigger a wave of nativism. Same things happen in like Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, today. Reasons why, and it's economics. Because US farmers overtook them, and that leads right to globalization. I just mentioned that. Globalization, American companies began to move more and more of their production overseas to avoid high weight, the higher wages in the United States. And no environmental laws. And so that triggered basically an end to almost all tariffs. Because once US companies begin to move abroad, they didn't want tariffs when they bring their goods back in. And so that's going to lead to a very much an interconnected world. And add one more thing to globalization, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which signed a treaty in 2000, US signed this World Trade Organization, and that basically took off all restrictions off of China. And once that happened, China became an absolute economic juggernaut. And almost all industrial production in the United States ended after that WTO organization. And now we're this interconnected world that we raise tariffs, everything goes up in price. Oh, we'll see. What's next? Inequality of wealth. Well, starting with once you reestablish trickle-down economics and supply side with Reaganomics, I think the United States has been supply side for them basically since 1981. There's been a massive wave of inequality of wealth. The goal of trickle-down economics, supply side conservative economics, is to funnel money in the hands of wealthy. The wealthy, and it's been incredibly successful. The wealthy have gotten incredibly wealthy. And with this inequality of wealth, a couple big things have happened. And one of the big things is you're going to have political inequality, where the wealthy are more and more going to take over the political system. You know, give $270 million to a presidential candidate a month, things like that. Literally take over the political system. Or 3 people give one presidential candidate $1.8 billion. And I hope you're thinking, and yes, that is more than I make in a year. Oh, but the vast inequality of wealth and one more thing that it's going to lead, or it's going to lead to, is you're really going to get a lot of resentment and a real feeling that the American dream is passing. It's part of the reason why we see more and more today people really upset by the way the country is going, because they're proud in debt. It's a real problem. Oh, I almost forgot one more thing with inequality of wealth, led to a real estate crisis. Because wealthy people could bid up homes. I can't imagine that happening in Bozeman, but it could. It could happen in Bozeman. To a lesser degree here, Missoula. It's not happening as much as you would think in Jordan markets. You know why? So we can all move to Jordan. Housing's relatively cheap. The election of 2000. This would be one of the closest elections in American history. Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, a Democrat, was running against George W. Bush, the governor of Texas, conservative governor of Texas, George H.W. Bush's son. He's actually not junior, but everyone called him junior. But the election was razor thin. Gore won the popular vote, but there was a contested vote in Florida. And it all came down to Florida. And the Supreme Court stopped a recount in the middle of the recount and gave the election to Bush in a 5-4 ruling. They said it would cause too much disruption to finish the recount because, and I'm not making this up, the television networks at first gave the election to Bush. They turned around and said, so the Supreme Court gave the election to Bush. The recount probably would have went to Gore, but it never was. So George W. Bush became president. And he immediately began a system of more conservative economics, huge tax cuts. Tax cuts on dividends and a massive decrease of the top marginal income tax rate. And so more supply side economics. So you can see, and add one thing to supply side and deregulation. Then that was the glass breaking. It's just your keys, right? deregulation. They quit regulating the stock market. And regulating all these different trades. It's so complex. But this will help trigger the 2008 financial crash that's coming. September 11th, 2001. So that is the September 11th terrorist attack on the United States. And this was done by a group by the name of Al Qaeda, the base, a group that America helped in a civil war in Afghanistan and then abandoned. And the reasons to attack was American support of brutal secular dictatorships, so not religious dictatorships in the Middle East, which the US was. And US troops in Saudi Arabia from that first Gulf War. And what's happening in Palestinians in Israel. That was the reason for the attack. The US made a whole series of absolute blunders and intelligence errors, so the attack mostly succeeded. And they hit a symbol they thought of US economic power, even though it's actually kind of half full renders, thankfully. Looking back at it now. But hit both World Trade Centers, both towers of the World Trade Center, hit the Pentagon, and a plane that was almost certainly on its way to the Capitol. It's actually the hijackers were overcome by passengers. One of the hijackers didn't make it, so they were under, and that was me there. They crashed in Pennsylvania. This is the second bloodiest day in American history. First bloodiest is still Antietam. And the goal of this was to try to get the US to react by attacking everybody in the Middle East so then they could say, look how the United States is this brutal power that just wants more evidence. The US kind of didn't work for Al Qaeda, they're psychopaths, but we kind of fell in their trap too. Al Qaeda was still based in Afghanistan, which was raging in the middle of the Civil War. So a month afterwards, the US got involved in that Civil War and picked a side who won that Civil War, kind of. But that's going to trigger a 21-year bloody quiet war. The US will be involved in Afghanistan. A couple thousand Americans and hundreds of thousands of Afghans would die. And the US would leave in 2022 in defeat. The government we helped replace came back into power. Remember about the American Revolution? Now the US just had to hold out. That's what the Afghans called the Taliban, who actually did not do the attack, but they sheltered their minds. Al-Qaeda got back in the power. I think I might be able to finish all this. Want me just to stop now? Want me to finish? Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina struck the United States 2006. A horrific hurricane in the South. And the big thing about this hurricane was it was category 5 turned into category 4, hit Louisiana and triggered massive floods in New Orleans. That hundreds of people would die in the floods because they wouldn't be evacuated. And because of budget cuts, the federal government, which has a group called FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, just put down FEMA, I think that should be enough. They asked it. They reacted slowly and inept. They were filled with cronies. It was just completely inept. And George W. Bush, who was relatively popular because you're kind of rallying behind him after September 11th, he would be blamed for incompetence that was somewhat justified by what happened in New Orleans. President Trump's in the process of getting rid of FEMA. So that's what's happening right now. Conservative economics. I mean, that's what I guess that's what it is. Bubble. The bubble is a housing bubble. A massive increase. An unprecedented bubble in prices for real estate. Real estate, homes, office buildings, you name it, went up in value. And this triggered a massive speculative boom. Investing in real estate, investing in mortgages, investing in debt, all these kind of overlapping debt, a little bit like the Great Depression. But housing prices were greatly overvalued. And this will also be the peak of home ownership. But at the same time, people were buying homes they could never afford. Banks were leveraged or in debt. Hundreds of, as we would find out, over $100 trillion in debt banks and other people have. And the whole thing crashed in 2008. The bubble, and that would be the Great Panic of 2008. Yeah.
The Iraq War, you skipped over that one.
Oh, that's not very big deal. Moving on. I did. The Iraq War, 2003 through, well, basically 2016 for the US. It's still going on with the Civil War. The United States invaded Iraq. So President Bush was still smarting over the fact that Hussein survived the first Gulf War back in 1991, 90 and 91. And Hussein made a big deal. I defeated the US because I survived. He let him stay because they knew if Hussein fell, Iraq would devolve into civil war. We knew that back in 91. So we just let this strong man stay. It's a horrible decision, but they did. But in 2003, President Bush, the Bush administration convinced the American public that Iraq was behind the September 11th attack in some way, which they were not at all. They were mortal enemies with Al-Qaeda. And that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. Now, they did actually try to build nuclear weapons back in the 80s. The program died with the first Gulf War. But they said, we know for a fact that Iraq has nuclear weapons. And in March of 2003, the United States, almost none of our allies joined in, except for Britain. Britain had their own intrigue in Iraq, but they invaded in March of 2003. Iraq didn't really have an army left after the first Gulf War. And so they were defeated relatively fast, but it turned into a bloody, horrible civil war that would last over a decade. 6,000 Americans would die, and we don't know how many Iraqis. The most conservative estimates say about 500,000 Iraqi civilians, Iraqi sides were, and the civil war rages to this day. It turned into a disaster beyond comprehension. You combine that with Katrina, you say that was kind of the Bush administration. Bush was incredibly popular in the early 2000s. By the time he left office, he was the most unpopular president in history. Up to that time. Up to that. Next, Great Recession. Great Recession. So the Great Recession was the recession that started out of that bubble and would go from 2007 until about 2015. It was a long-term time of high unemployment, a stagnant economy, and a credit freeze. Banks were scared to loan money, a credit freeze. A long-term economic disaster. And it was arguably triggered by the big tax cuts, the supply side economics, but also the big inequality of wealth. You eventually get to the point where people just couldn't afford to buy stuff. That keeps rising and rising and rising. When consumer debt goes up, that's always like a sure sign that a recession is. The bailout. So right before President Bush left office after a second term, he proposed a bailout of the big banks. And it's going to be called TARP. Toxic Asset Recovery Program. Toxic Asset Recovery Program. Just found TARP. Just found on TARP. It was a bailout of the bank. It's so hard to explain what the assets were. It would take me days just to explain what a credit default swap is. And then your head would explode and be messy, and I don't want that. So it was a big bailout of the banks for making all those risky loans that helped lead to the panic. And it's going to be about $800 billion direct from taxpayer money to the banks and the bankers. So they were made clean, they were made flush. And the Federal Reserve would give about $15 trillion to the banks. So a massive bailout to the banks, which by the way told the banks to keep doing it. Don't worry, you're fine. All right, so does that bailout Trump? That be passed during the Bush administration, but in the meantime, while that is going on, there was an election. And you can imagine, Republican president, disasters happen, the Democrats would do very well, and the Democrats would elect Barack Obama. And his first big initiative would be what's called the stimulus bill by Barack Obama. Obama's stimulus bill was going to be a little bit like he thought, kind of act like the New Deal, but it's going to be about a $750 billion stimulus to the economy and tax cuts, government spending to stop the free fall of the Great Recession. It stopped the free fall. The economy quit dropping, unemployment quit dropping, but it was not big enough to get the economy growing. And then he adopted austerity in 2010. He was a conservative Democrat. He adopted austerity, and the economy remained kind of that Great Recession, stagnant for another 4 or 5 years, which almost without a doubt led to the emergence of President, without a doubt. Oh, one more thing I forgot about the stimulus. It was part of the stimulus was supposed to be to help people who lost their homes by foreclosure when the housing bubble collapsed. But the Obama administration decided to funnel that money to the bank system. So over 1 million people lost their homes. Why? It was pretty conservative. Push the money to the wealthy, idea they would spend it on. So, healthcare. Part of this big initiative now we got elected was to try to have some kind of insurance reform for healthcare and applying to be universal insurance. And this would be called the Affordable Care Act or the ACA, but soon everyone's going to call it Obamacare. And what it is, it's insurance reform. So reform insurance, but also expand healthcare. It's called Medicaid. Expand healthcare for people, working class people, if they could not get it from their job. And the number of people without health insurance, it halved. So it did help, but it was very complex, hard to follow, and prices did not. The growth in healthcare prices did not slow as much as they had thought they did. Healthcare. But about 30 million people got healthcare, did not. Half those are children. That's what I'm talking block right. Occupy. I don't know why I put Wall Street, but I did not mean Wall Street. It's Wall Street. 2011, there were massive protests about the inequality of wealth. And it began by occupying a park near Wall Street with the idea to try to bring people's attention to the massive inequality of wealth. And so the idea would be things like more government aid for education, to do something about the high cost of college and student loans, and to start regulating Wall Street. And without a doubt, this had great impact down the road on people with more liberal economics, and more they would say progressive, but we always have these different terms. And will lead to these elements of the Democratic Party to kind of abandon their conservative economic views, kind of become a little more liberal. In response, though, most Republicans reacted with an anger over President Obama, and it wasn't blatantly because of him personally, but also the policies like the ACA and the stimulus, and that would be a reaction with the idea being to cut taxes, and they call themselves the Tea Party, a conservative movement. So kind of at the same time of Occupy Wall Street. And the Tea Party would most certainly evolve into supporters of President. But it was an element of the Republican Party. I'm almost done. So, impressed with me? Act like you are. You impressed with me? I'm impressed with you. The Roberts Court. John Roberts would be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, still is, appointed by George W. Bush. And this court would be the most conservative court since the 19th century. And so a number of laws that would restrict civil rights also begin to gut environmental laws. Conservative, and that's conservative economics. Environmental laws are they're opposed to it. And be pro-corporate, very pro-corporation, especially on pollution. They pretty much got rid of the any kind of wild pollution. So let's get the Citizen United. Two big court cases were that Citizen United. That court case basically said that corporations are people. And there can be no restrictions on their political contributions. And boy, could you see what happened now? The corporations now contribute so much money. The individuals are running more corporations. And the Heller decision was another incredibly important decision. And that is for the first time in American history. 16 years ago this happened. But the Heller decision said that the Second Amendment now allows for personal ownership of guns. It does not allow militia. So before, for most of American history, the Second Amendment was about militia and not about personal ownership of guns. The Heller decision would change. The last two, you notice I ended in 2016. I don't think we'll have any questions after that. 2016. This was the election. So after 2 terms for President Obama, the Democrats would nominate former Senator and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for president. And in a very contested election, because the Democratic Party was kind of moving against more conservative, like Hillary Clinton. That would see out of nowhere, like a guy named Bernie Sanders almost won the nomination. But the Republicans, shocking everybody, nominated an absolute political novice, Donald Trump. But remember, he's a dark horse. He had no history, so he could invent it. And even though he was a, not that successful a businessman, he played one on TV, literally, a very popular television show called The Apprentice. I never watched, but I know a lot of people loved. So he could make this character. I mean, it was incredibly successful. And he was mostly conservative, but he also had a lot of appeals to working class people, saying he'll bring wages back up and things like that. Everybody believed that Clinton would win. All the polls had Clinton win. But it really hit an underswell of resentment and people angry over the bad years of the economic depression. And the Republican Party at first was, the hierarchy of the Republican Party was kind of against Trump, but they finally decided, boys, you do basically everything we want conservative economic wise. And so in one of the biggest political upsets in history, Trump would be elected, even though he lost the popular vote. Fairly significant. But remember, that doesn't matter. Oh, one more thing began. You can see it early on in the decade, but there's going to be a widening gulf between men and women. And men are increasingly becoming more conservative, or at least voting more conservative. I don't know if they're, I think there's a lot of like, and women are increasingly becoming more democratic and more. Interesting to watch. It wasn't always like that. Slightly, but the gulf is now huge, especially with your generation. It's like unprecedented. It's like 40-point different now. It's really wild. And last one. And so this is where we really get now in this divide we have right now between conservative and liberal economics. Where we have conservative economics where it's clearly President Trump personifies it. Supply side economics, funnel money to the very wealthy with the idea that that will bring prosperity. And liberal economics is starting to make a reemergence of Keynesian economics stuff out a little bit when President Biden was elected in 2020. But let me add one more thing. So much of conservative and liberal has come down to cultural wars and different cultural arguments about race, about women, about rights for Americans, especially as most of you know about rights for trans people. And it's culture war issue that divide over it. And that's what so many people vote over gun rights or abortion. All of those rulings. Oh, let's add one more thing for the Roberts Court. The Dobbs decision. For the Roberts Court, kind of a big deal, I forgot. Even though this is gonna happen a little bit after the time frame in this would overturn Roe versus Wade and allow states to decide abortion. Montana has decided, it's in our constitution anyways, but there's, it's very upset in the state legislature. Any questions? You get a lot done? Wow, I covered blocks. Are you happy? I decided not to make this due, and so I'm kidding. I said I would help. Orange, no, everything. I'm kidding. No. I mean, I wouldn't. No. It's all for you. We can take it out. All I'm gonna do when I check it, I'm gonna pick out a few to make it a series. I'm gonna give you credit because I know how hard you worked on those. Something. So I assigned that, and you had to do, it was due today. That practice test on AP Classroom. So I also know that the AP Classroom website is a disaster. Hey, have fun on Friday. I am sorry about that. So I'll give you another day, we'll see what happens. Sound good? Because I've had so many people tell me they couldn't get in. And it just appears to be a luck of the draw. Oh, by the way. I've had a few people get 100%.
I don't know, that's 20 away from.
You're back. Really? Put together. I hope that helped. I'll see all of you. I'm just seeing what's.
I love all the parties.
Give me the. Oh, I got this.
7 days.
No, they all of them. These are old. I think you said on those.
So what does it do about it? And do you think?
Don't worry. I thought no worries.
And you,
No, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be quick.
No,
I'm sorry, yes, no, that's our.
Can I borrow this?
Bring back to the.
I've been doing.
Really, yeah. All they use me to.
Yeah.
Don't surprise them now.
I beat the like the first try. It's so easy.
Don't get it.
310.
It was difficult. Wait, I know for long session back, but yes, and stop me like different. Okay.
And we just go back and make someone.
Yes.
And here, got it.
It was just like I was like stuck between two. Yeah.
I need to see this show.
Why? Because I'm the seniors. I know when I'm having split.
Yeah, no.
I'll put it in on Thursday.
So we do.
Just a few ones.
Is there any other extensions? Well, are we gonna?
I do want you to, have to 27. 28, just hang on.
Okay. So you wait. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Okay.
just a moment, right? It's for 27.
Okay. Not for 28?
No.
Sorry, Bart, just like 2 minutes late, but
It's, you're gotcha. Okay, sit, rip it up, throw it away.